You see it every day. The bow tie on the tailgate of a Silverado pulling into a job site at 6 in the morning. The bow tie on a Corvette in a magazine, on a Camaro idling in a high school lot, on the Impala your grandfather drove. Chevrolet. The word is stamped on millions of vehicles in every parking lot in America, and it has been for 100 years. It means trucks and small towns and Sunday drives. It means American. But it was never an American word. It was a man's last name. And that man was a Swiss watchmaker's son who dropped out of school at 11, crossed the Atlantic with the cash in his pocket, became the most famous race car driver in the country, founded the company you know, and then died broke, working as a mechanic on its assembly line, building the cars that wore his own name. The name on millions of American cars belongs to a man who never made a single dollar from it. He watched his partner take the company, beat Henry Ford with it, and leave him standing outside the door. That's not the story on the brochure. That's the story the brochure was built to bury. If that's the kind of story you come here for, the one behind the badge, not the marketing, subscribe. Now let's go back to a watchmaker's shop in 1878. Louis-Joseph Chevrolet was born on Christmas Day, 1878, in La Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland, a town that lived and breathed watchmaking. He was the second son in a family of 9. His father, Joseph, made watches and clocks, and in a place built entirely on that craft, that trade should have been enough to keep a family fed. It wasn't. When Louis was a boy, an economic slump hit so hard, the family packed up and crossed the border into Beaune, France, a small town in the Burgundy wine country, where his father opened a new watch shop that never brought in enough to feed 7 children. There were days the family didn't eat, not days of being short on money, days with no food on the table at all. That was the childhood that made the man. At 11, Louis left school for good and took a job at the Roblin workshop in Beaune, where they repaired bicycles and carriages. He learned the trade fast, faster than the men around him, and something in those machines caught him. By 16, he had designed his own bicycle. He called it the Frontenac, and he entered it in the bicycle races they held in the hills around Beaune. And he didn't just compete in them, he won them, over and over, for years. Those wins did 2 things at once. The prize money put food on a table that had known empty days, and the speed put a hook in him that never came out. He would spend the rest of his life chasing it, and in the end, it would cost him everything. By 1899, he designed another bicycle, the Gladiator, good enough to get him work at the mechanical shops of Moors and Durant, 2 of the great early names of the French auto industry. There, for the first time, he put his hands on the internal combustion engine. He moved through the workshops of the era, Hotchkiss, de Dion-Bouton, and he learned how engines worked, the 4-stroke cycle, the moving parts, the brutal physics of making a machine go fast. He was a watchmaker's son, raised on precision and tiny tolerances, and he turned that same patience on engines 10 times the size of a pocket watch. He banked all of it. He'd need every bit of it. And an American he'd met once, completely by accident, was waiting on the other side of the ocean. That accident had happened a couple of years earlier. A teenage mechanic was sent out to repair a broken, steam-driven tricycle, one of the first self-propelled machines anyone in the region had ever laid eyes on. The man who owned it was an American, and not just any American. He was a Vanderbilt, heir to one of the largest fortunes on the planet, a name that meant railroads and unimaginable wealth. He stood and watched this poor Swiss kid take the machine apart and put it back together, working when no one else could fix it. And he told the boy something simple: your future is in America. The kid had no money, no English, and not a single relative on the far side of the Atlantic. He went anyway. In 1899, working now for Moores, the company sent Louis across the ocean to Canada. He landed in Montreal and took a job as a chauffeur and mechanic. 6 months driving and fixing cars for the wealthy, a long way from the boy who'd gone hungry in Beaune. Then in 1901, he made the move he'd been pointed towards since that tricycle: New York. He caught on with the American branch of de Dion-Bouton, at that moment the largest car company in the world. The job didn't last. The branch shut down inside a year, and Louis scraped by selling and repairing high-end European cars and taking whatever driving work he could find just to eat. His father died back in France that same year, and Louis began bringing the rest of the family across the ocean to join him, including his younger brothers, Arthur and Gaston, who would race alongside him for the rest of his life. He wouldn't even become an American citizen until 1915, the same year the company bearing his name would slip out of his hands. For now, he was just another immigrant mechanic in New York, dividing his days between selling cars he could never afford, fixing them when they broke, and chasing any seat in any race that would have him. Then, in 1905, came the break. The New York distributor for Fiat needed a substitute driver, and they handed the wheel to the muscular young immigrant with the foreign name. On May 20th, 1905, at the old Hippodrome at Morris Park, Louis Chevrolet lined up for his first real race against Barney Oldfield, the most famous driver in America, and Walter Christie, another giant of the sport. Louis beat them both. A nobody, off the boat a few years earlier, barely any English, faster than the best in the country on his first time out. The New York papers ran his name on the front page, and in a timed run, he tore off the measured mile in 52 4/5 seconds, a world record for the distance, a number that in 1905 sounded almost impossible. It helped that he was built for it. 6 feet tall, 195 pounds, thick through the shoulders, with a heavy mustache and the hands of a man who'd spent his life inside machines. Early race cars had cart spring suspension and steering that fought you the whole way around the track, and wrestling one of those machines at speed took raw physical strength most men simply didn't have. Louis had it. He drove like a man who'd gone hungry as a child and decided he was finished being afraid of anything. In early 1906, he went down to the sands at Ormond Beach in Florida and drove a monstrous 200 horsepower Durant, and for a short time, he held the world land speed record at 119 miles an hour, until another driver edged past him. He worked for a stretch in Philadelphia for John Walter Christie, helping develop a front-wheel drive racing car, a design decades ahead of its time that never amounted to much on the track, but more engineering knowledge banked in a mind that never stopped collecting it. And the cost was written on his body. He raced for 15 years, and by some estimates, he spent the equivalent of 3 full years of his life in hospital beds, recovering from crashes. He raced the Vanderbilt Cup on Long Island again and again. In 1910, a wheel of his Marquette Buick caught in a rut. The steering snapped, and the car slammed into a streetcar, tore through a fence, hit a tree, and landed upside down. His riding mechanic, Charles Miller, was killed. Deaths and wrecks like that one ended road racing on Long Island for good. Louis kept climbing back into cars. He was a public figure now, a man the crowds came to see, and in the grandstands, a fired executive was watching him win, and thinking not about racing at all, but about the name painted on the side of the car. By 1909, he was one of the leading drivers in America, and the papers had handed him a nickname that stuck: the Daredevil Frenchman. The man watching wasn't a fan. He was William Durant, who had co-founded General Motors and then been thrown out of his own company by the bankers in a financial crisis. Durant wanted back in, and he understood something most engineers never figured out. A car is sold twice, once as a machine, and once as a name. He thought Chevrolet sounded fast and foreign and expensive, exactly the kind of name a man would pay for. Durant didn't want a driver. He wanted that name to stamp on a car and sell to America. He invited Louis and Arthur to a dirt track sprint behind the Buick plant in Flint. Louis won it, and both brothers were signed to the Buick racing team, Louis as a driver, Arthur as Durant's personal chauffeur. Louis rewarded that faith almost at once, winning the 400-mile Kobe Trophy race at Crown Point, Indiana, but he kept getting hurt. In one Vanderbilt Cup, he led every single lap until 8 from the finish, when a steering connection broke and handed the win away. After the crash that killed Charles Miller, Durant pulled him off the track for good. The driver was too valuable to bury, and the name was worth far more standing up than wrapped around a tree. Durant's logic was cold and correct. He'd lost General Motors, and he meant to claw his way back. And to do it, he needed a brand with shine on it. So on November 3rd, 1911, the Chevrolet Motor Car Company was incorporated in Detroit. Louis brought in his brother Arthur. The plan, on paper, was simple. Louis would design the cars, Durant would sell them. The problem was that the two men wanted to build two completely different companies, and neither one of them knew it yet. Louis spent more than 6 months with his friend Etienne Planche designing the first Chevrolet, the Classic 6, a stylish, powerful 6-cylinder machine with a 4.8-liter engine, one of the biggest of its kind, capable of 65 miles an hour. It launched in 1913 at a price of $2,250, roughly $65,000 in today's money. It sold around 500 units that first year. Louis looked at that car and saw a masterpiece, the kind of machine that deserved to carry his name. Durant looked at the price tag and saw a problem. Henry Ford was proving, right then with the Model T, that the real money was in cheap cars sold by the million, and Durant wanted that money. Louis wanted to build beautiful, fast, expensive things, machines that would do his name justice in a way a stripped-down economy car never could. The two visions could not share a single company. He left for a trip back to Europe, proud of the car he'd built, certain the Classic 6 was the future of the brand. While he was gone, Durant began quietly rebuilding the entire company behind his back. He came home to find it already done. Durant had restructured the company around low-budget cars, the exact opposite of everything Louis believed a car wearing his name should be, and he'd done it without asking. The cheaper models were coming, priced for the masses. The fight that finally ended it, though, wasn't about engines or price points or strategy. It was about a cigar. Louis had a habit of talking to clients and suppliers with a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. Durant, who'd sold cigars as a young man and had opinions about them, told him that an executive of a rising company shouldn't be seen that way, that he should move up to a proper cigar, something more respectable. To Durant, it was a small thing about image. To Louis Chevrolet, the immigrant who had gone days without eating as a boy, who'd quit school at 11, who had buried a riding mechanic and spent years of his life in hospital beds, it was the final insult. The man who'd already taken his company, now reaching for the way he carried himself. A shouting match broke out, and Louis looked at him and said it plain. "I've given you my name. I'll be damned if I'm giving you my personality, too." He walked out. In 1915, he sold his entire stake in the Chevrolet Motor Company to Durant. He took the cash, he signed over the rights, and he walked away from the chance to become one of the richest men in America. Because within a year, Durant used the soaring value of Chevrolet stock to buy back a controlling interest in General Motors itself, folding the company Louis built into the empire that had once thrown Durant out the door. He pulled it off by trading 5 shares of Chevrolet stock for every single share of General Motors. And on the 7th anniversary of the day GM had been founded, Durant walked into the directors' meeting and declared he now owned more than half the company. The name was the lever that moved all of it, one of the biggest corporate comebacks in American history, built entirely on a word that belonged to a man who just walked away. Louis Chevrolet never saw a cent of it. He didn't stop. He used the money from the sale to start the Frontenac Motor Company, building fast race cars, and for a while it worked beautifully. He and Gaston tore up the track, and in 1920, a car Louis built won the Indianapolis 500 with Gaston behind the wheel. The next year, another of his cars won it again. The name Chevrolet was winning at the highest level of American racing, on Louis' own terms, free of Durant. Then Gaston was at a board track race in Beverly Hills. There was a crash. He didn't get up. Louis was destroyed by it. He swore he would never race again. And from that moment, everything he had left began to come apart. A Wall Street scandal voided his backers, and left him holding development costs he couldn't carry, and bankruptcy followed. He started over again with Arthur, the Chevrolet Brothers Manufacturing Company, building automobile and light aircraft engines, with distribution reaching Canada, England, and Australia. And then the Great Depression killed it. He launched an aircraft engine venture in Indianapolis, building a lightweight motor, and the same crash that flattened the country flattened that too. Each time he climbed back into a car, and each time the wheels snapped in his hands. And while the founder fell, the company that carried his name climbed. By the early 1930s, the Chevrolet International and the cheap, reliable models Durant had bet everything on were doing exactly what Durant promised, outselling Ford, putting a bow tie on roads in every state. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler had become the three giants of the American automobile. The badge was becoming one of the most recognized symbols on Earth, and the man whose surname it was had nothing left, and nowhere left to go but back through its front door. So with no better option, he walked back into the company he had founded, and they gave him a job. Not an office, not a title. They put Louis Chevrolet on the assembly line as a mechanic, building the cars that carried his own name. There was no ceremony, no welcome. Most of the men working the line beside him had no idea who he was, or that the word stamped on the machine in front of them was the name of the broke old man tightening its bolts. Think about the cruelty of the arithmetic. He'd founded the company on a luxury car he was proud of, and the company had become the best-selling brand in America by building exactly the cheap cars he'd refused to make. Same name, opposite philosophy, and only one side of it ever got rich. Durant didn't keep his prize either. He lost control of General Motors a second time in 1920, bought out over his debts. The man who'd erased the founder erased in turn. Neither man who started Chevrolet was there to enjoy what it became. By then, he had been living quietly in Florida, far from the factories. Much of what was left of his old life, the engineering drawings, the photographs, the records of everything he designed, burned in a fire at his sister's home and was simply gone, as if the past were being erased ahead of the man. For Louis, the body went the way the fortune had. Atherosclerosis choked off the circulation in his leg, and in 1938, doctors amputated it, forcing him into retirement. On June 6, 1941, a heart attack killed him in Detroit. He was 62 years old. His brother Arthur, who'd been there at the founding back in 1911, sank into depression in the years after and took his own life in 1946. And the name went on without any of them. In 1953 came the Corvette with its fiberglass body, the first commercially successful American sports car. Then the Impala, a car so popular it sold over 1 million units a year in 1965 and again in 1966, a record that stood unbroken for decades. The bow tie spread to every corner of the country, and then the world. A monument to him eventually went up at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, long after the men beside him never knew his face. The name conquered America exactly the way Durant said it would, by becoming everything the man who owned it had refused to build. So here's the paradox you started with, carrying the full weight of it now. The word Chevrolet on millions of American vehicles is the surname of a watchmaker's son who went days without food as a child, who broke the world record for the measured mile the first real time they put him on a track, who buried his mechanic and his brother for the sake of speed, who founded the company with his own hands, who refused a fortune over the way he held a cigar, and who died working on that company's assembly line without a single man beside him knowing whose name they were building. Was he right to walk away from a fortune over his pride? Or did that one decision cost him everything for nothing? Drop a comment, because honestly, I still go back and forth on it. He's buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Indianapolis, a few hundred feet from the racetrack where he was once a legend, under a name that millions of Americans drive every single day, and not one of them connects to a man.